Hello everyone, my name is Nereida Carrillo, and today I'm going to be presenting my research on the Gaza front, or more specifically, understanding selective mutism through the impact of trauma and bilingualism, specifically with children in the West Bank. So, for example, I would like everyone to imagine that they are a 4-year-old child who has just witnessed their parents, the life of their parents being taken away in a violent manner, being displaced in a refugee camp, in a completely different region. You are not familiar with the dialect, you are not familiar with the culture. There's this pervasive threat, you hear airstrikes around you, and you have no home. So this scenario that I just described to you, along with food insecurity, water scarcity, and of course no local home and no family members. That scenario that I just described is the exact scenario that I wanted to look into for my research, while we're understanding the trauma response that these children are going through, and also the trauma of moving to a different country and not knowing the language, or at least the dialect, in this region. So, what is selective mutism? Selective mutism is a psychological condition characterized by the lack of or absence of speech in social settings where speech is usually expected, like school, despite still speaking in other settings, maybe like at home. The DSM also requires certain diagnostic criteria to be fulfilled before the child is diagnosed with selective mutism. So this is consistent failure to speak in social settings where speech is usually expected or required. It has to interfere with your social, your academic, or your occupational functioning. It must last at least 1 month, and it cannot be the first month of school. It cannot also be attributed to the lack of comfort with the language or the lack of knowledge of the language of the region. And it cannot also be better explained by another communication disorder. I do want to preface that this is the diagnostic criteria from the DSM, which is heavily influenced by westernized context. These are the risk factors of SM, and while we have not one single agreed upon cause as to why SM develops in certain children and why it doesn't develop in other children, we do know that trauma does play a big factor in the reason why children develop selective mutism. So this could probably be after a stressful event, right? So I have some examples of their death or school changes, but we do know that it's not the primary cause. So in the case for children in the West Bank, this is a pervasive threat that they're constantly facing. So like I mentioned in the example at the beginning, right? Food, water scarcity, no home, having to acculturate to this new culture, in this new region, not knowing the dialect of the region. So a lot of stress factors that built into this, which goes into how these children are at high risk for developing SM and the severity of their symptoms because they're bilingual and because of the stress that they face immigrating to this new region. So what does the literature today say about SM, right? So we see this huge underrepresentation of youth, of refugee/immigrant children in current literature, and we also see this huge gap when it comes to trauma and SM. So selective mutism is usually attributed as an anxiety disorder when it comes to the current literature. And whenever we do see trauma attributed to why it develops in children and with SM, it's usually with emerging work in LGBTQ youth. So, however, it's very, very important to recognize that children's experiences in the West Bank are going to be vastly different from those in a Western context and other immigrant children who are not in war/conflict-affected regions. Given that, since 2006, children in Palestine have consistently ranked highest on the World Health Organization's Trauma Index every single year. More children were killed in Gaza in the last year alone than in all other global conflicts over the past 5 years combined. So really taking into account the trauma experienced by these children in the West Bank, how it is contextually different from all other children who are also immigrants, but are not facing the same trauma that these children are facing, specifically because the threat that they're facing is pervasive and is ongoing. Which led into my research question, right? So I saw that there was this lack of research within refugee populations, immigrant populations, and even populations who are living in war/conflict-affected regions. So I wanted to know what selective mutism looks like, how does it develop, how is it diagnosed, considering trauma and bilingualism in its development. For my methodology, I used a systematic review of a total of 17 different articles. I used keywords like selective mutism, youth, trauma, DQ, refugee, bilingualism. I did prioritize peer-reviewed articles published after 2016, like PubMed, PsycInfo, SciteNet, Web of Science. I mean, they're all up there, right? But I also referenced reports from nonprofit organizations like UNICEF and SOS Children's Village, specifically because, as I mentioned earlier, that population is not recognized in the current literature. So I did have to use these reports for the real-life conditions that these children are facing and the real-time data on the statistics that we're seeing, the diagnostics that we're seeing in these refugee camps. Okay, my key findings. So we know that SN is linked to trauma, especially chronic stress. For example, Palestinian children we know aren't undergoing chronic stress because this is a pervasive threat, like I mentioned several times, right? These are children who are immigrating to a new region, don't know the dialect, aren't aware of the culture that's surrounding them, and again, it's pervasive because there's still airstrikes, they're still bulldozing their homes, right? So it's still ongoing, even though they've received like these asylum in these refugee camp, they're still undergoing threat. They're still not at ease or still facing anxiety. We also know that bilingualism and immigrant status complicate the diagnosis. Misdiagnosis can be complicated so much in this bilingualism because, or immigrant status, let's say if I'm coming from a different region, right? What's normalized in my culture, maybe my culture prioritizes not speaking so much in certain social settings. Where in this new region, if you maybe aren't as outspoken, or if your child doesn't speak that much in social settings, now that child's going to be diagnosed with SM when they really don't have selective mutism. When it comes to bilingualism, there are language differences. Again, we're talking about children who are moving to the West Bank and maybe not familiar with the dialect. And so they're not comfortable speaking language there in that region. Again, can lead to the misdiagnosis of SM in these children. And we also know that SM presents differently in immigrant children versus children who are born in the West Bank. So we know that symptom severity is different for children who are born and raised in the West Bank than children who are immigrating there, because we have the factor of the ongoing stress that they're facing with a different dialect, having to move to a completely different region on their own. We've seen children as young as like 2 years old, obviously goes younger, but verbal inhibition can only be accounted for someone who can't already speak. Some of the limitations from my study. There is a lack of research in conflict zones, and I mean, we know this because we discussed it earlier, right? But the current research is not capturing the underdiagnosis also due to the lack of mental health care providers. So even in these like SOS Children's Village, there's a limited amount of mental health care workers that we have. So even if we are seeing numbers of children being diagnosed with SM, it's not an accurate representation because we have very limited staff in these villages. And even it's really hard to even get into one of these villages. There's a lot of restraints on being able to just move your family. And even then if you're a child alone, it's much harder, right? And we also must treat their situation differently because this is a pervasive threat. So we have seen it with trauma before. However, the trauma's already passed, so now the child is learning to cope with it afterwards. This traumatic response, these child they're technically really stuck in this dissociative state, right? So they can't fight, because you can't fight airstrikes, you're 4 years old. You can't really flee anywhere, right? Because we're familiar with the fight or flight response. You can't flee anywhere because you're 4 years old, where are you going to go? Technically, you already fled right here in this refugee camp. But there's still a pervasive threat following you. We also know that the literature focuses on Western populations. These children are not facing the same types of trauma or the same types of stress that the children in the West Bank are facing. Moving forward, I think we really need to reconceptualize the way we understand selective mutism within its criteria, within the definition, because we're using this westernized definition and the criteria to meet this diagnosis. And in reality, maybe this is a normalized response, right? So in this region, a lot of these children, we're seeing more surges of children reacting this way. We probably need to normalize this diagnosis more as a trauma response, instead of just, oh, this child is shy, oh, this is a speech issue. It depends on how we diagnose the children, depending on the context that they're living in, the region that they're living in. And we need to consider sociocultural and linguistic factors as well. So moving to a different region, how to acclimate to that culture, right? Or the differences, of course, in language. Maybe the child is trying to explain what they're feeling in their own language, and that means something else in the language of that region, right? So, can lead to misdiagnosis. And just overall, the recognition of selective mutism within this population, because again, selective mutism isn't recognized as a traumatic response, more so as a speech issue due to the westernized influence of the DSM and the diagnostic criteria. I'd like to thank Dr. McCormick, who was my professor and honestly just led me to really get my keen interest in trauma. And I remember I met up with him after my class, and I was like, hey, I have this honors thesis, and I think you're the perfect person to do this with. And he was on board on the first day. And I want to thank my friends and my family also for always supporting me, because I ask a lot of questions. And of course, the same Edwards Social Sciences faculty, because I know I could pop my head into any of those offices, and somebody was going to answer all my questions. Thank you. Yeah, we can do questions.
Yeah.
Yes, sorry, what was it?
Sarah Clear was a therapist survivors of child sexual abuse. We see a lot of kids with selective mutism. I always struggle a lot with that name because there's nothing selective about it, right? It's a trauma adaptation, a biological response. If you can name it something else, what would you call it?
Reactive mutism. Yeah, because it's definitely. Well, as someone who also had been diagnosed with selective mutism from the ages of 6 to 8, reading over the diagnostic criteria in the DSM didn't fit my diagnosis, at least looking back. Because it was more reactive, choosing it as selective, at least from cases that I have seen before, you have adults and children talking about how the trauma is located either in their chest cavity or in their throat. So even though they want to speak and want to kind of regulate that emotion, that verbal condition doesn't allow them to. So I would call it reactive mutism. Any questions? Yes.
When you were doing your research on selective mutism, did you see that there were any combinations with learning disabilities or individuals being able to functionally acclimate mentally to something like trying to learn or education?
Because they had selective mutism?
Or just in connection to it, like interesting something that behaviors and positive behaviors?
Yeah, there was a lack or an impaired academic functionality, right? Because you're required to answer questions, you're required to participate in class. And when we're looking at it through the lens of trauma, this child is stuck in a dissociative state. And I guess it's easy to think, they're in a classroom, right? They're away from their trauma. Let's talk about someone who's facing sexual assault can also go through this dissociative state. That child is still stuck in a very anxious state of mind. So yes, the classroom's going on, the teacher's teaching, but they're not going to be paying attention because that fear is still in their mind. It's like an obsession. Yes.
So, for kids with reactive mutism, what kind of things do you practitioners or therapists can do to help that?
It depends on which population you're treating. For example, if we're talking about the children in West Bank, I can't come up to this child and ask them, hey, how are you feeling? Or it's safe now, because it's not. So that child is still stuck in that state of fear. So just recognizing their fears and working with them and assessing them very slowly, because they're still living through that trauma. And you, as a practitioner, can't say, the trauma's going to end tomorrow or a few months, right? So diagnosing them and assessing them, even effectively treating them, is really hard because the staff that we do have in these villages are not equipped or trained to deal with SM in these populations. So it just depends on the population we're working with. Any other questions?
Thank you so much for a great. What I think is the second best part, the first part is getting to hear your presentation, of course. I wanted to invite Dr. McCormick, your advisor, to come and present you with a cord and a stool that you'll wear in recognition not only of the years that you've put into this thesis project, but in everything that you've contributed to the honors community since you've been here. So it's lovely to see you in that regalia. I hope you'll wear it with pride at graduation. And I'd love to give Dr. McCormick a chance to say a few things.
Yeah, of course. Congratulations, Nereida. That was fantastic. I learned a lot here. A couple things about Nereida. I haven't known you too long. I think we just met maybe last spring. But immediately I was so impressed, not just with all the good intellectual stuff and how well you learn in critical, but just your passion for childhood trauma. If you don't know Nereida, she's going to go into a career working in some capacity, helping survivors of childhood trauma. It is going to be an absolute force in that work. I tell my students all the time, the only thing worse than to experience childhood trauma is to experience it alone, and it gives me so much relief and so much joy to know that there are folks out there like you who are going to be out there working with survivors of child trauma. So congratulations, you did a great